racial prejudice and mistreatment faced by the black nurse. Amidst the sterile walls and brightly lit hallways of Rosewood Medical Center, Jasmine Williams stepped onto the floor with both hope and anxiety in her heart. The polished tiles seemed to shimmer beneath her as she walked, but they couldn't mask the unease in her stomach. Rosewood, a prestigious hospital known for its high standards of care, was meant to be her fresh start. Yet even before her first shift began, Jasmine could sense something lingering in the air, an invisible wall of doubt and suspicion. Jasmine had worked tirelessly to earn her spot here, rising above the hurdles of systemic inequities that had plagued her journey in nursing school. Raised in a modest neighborhood where opportunities were scarce, she'd faced the sting of dismissal in every aspect of her life, subtle yet consistent. From whispered remarks in classrooms to stares when she entered spaces where few people looked like her, Jasmine had been forced to work harder than anyone to prove her worth. And she did. Every single time. She graduated top of her class, her tenacity and skill shining through despite the odds. Yet as she stepped into the nurse's station at Rosewood, all that hard work seemed to fall away under the scrutiny of her colleagues' eyes. Conversations faltered when she approached. The buzz of activity that filled the station earlier came to a sudden halt, replaced by a chilling silence. The glance from one nurse lingered a fraction too long, as if Jasmine were an unwelcome visitor, a disruption to the perfect polished image the hospital projected. As she approached her supervisor's office, the weight of their gaze on her back made every step feel like an echo in an empty room. The air was thick with subtle judgment, the unspoken assumption that someone like Jasmine, a black woman in a white-dominated field, was somehow less deserving of the role she held. She tried to push aside the growing sense of isolation, to hold her head high as her mother's words echoed in her mind, reminding her that she was stronger than any glance or whisper. But it was hard. The tension was palpable. Even Dr. Robert Morrow, one of the senior physicians, made it clear with his terse greeting that he was less than impressed with her presence. "Ms. Williams?" Dr. Morrow had said, his voice devoid of warmth. "I trust you're aware of the high expectations we have here. I hope you can meet them." His words, though professional on the surface, carried an undertone of doubt, one that Jasmine knew well. It was a question not just about her competency, but about her right to even be here. And as he briskly walked away, his eyes not even bothering to meet hers, Jasmine was left standing in the corridor, a wave of frustration rising in her chest. The first day wore on with similar exchanges, polite but distant nurses, terse interactions, and the feeling of constantly being under a microscope. Jasmine was keenly aware that no matter how well she performed her duties, she was being watched differently, as if every action she took would be scrutinized more harshly than her colleagues. The underlying message was clear. She had to prove herself, and prove herself again. As the day drew to a close, Jasmine overheard two nurses gossiping as they passed by. One of them remarked, "I don't know what they were thinking. She doesn't belong here." The other snorted, "Yeah, this place is too good for someone like her. She won't last." Jasmine's heart sank. She had hoped, desperately, that it was just the usual first-day jitters, that the coldness was just a product of unfamiliarity. But the reality was setting in. It wasn't just her newness that had them on edge. It was the fact that she was black, that she didn't fit their vision of who a nurse at Rosewood was supposed to be. And this was only the beginning. The tears that threatened to well up were quickly pushed aside. She had faced worse in her life, and she wouldn't let the prejudices of others bring her down. But it was hard, harder than she had imagined. Each step, each smile felt like a performance. Her professionalism was being tested, not just by her patients, but by her co-workers who saw her as an outsider. That evening, as she sat alone at the bus stop, waiting for her ride home, Jasmine felt the weight of it all. The battle against the constant undercurrent of racism was exhausting, and she was only beginning to understand just how much it would take to survive here. But in that moment of quiet, when the world seemed to pause, Jasmine made a promise to herself. She wouldn't let them break her. She had worked too hard for this moment, and she would endure. The VIP patient's role in the unfolding events. The following morning, Jasmine arrived at Rosewood Medical Center with a sense of quiet determination. Despite the previous day's challenges, she resolved to face each moment with resilience. Her uniform, freshly pressed and crisp, felt like a shield against the weight of the hospital's subtle hostility. But as she approached the nurses' station that day, the air was charged with an unexpected excitement. Nurses were moving quickly, gathering supplies and discussing an upcoming patient. Something big was about to happen. As Jasmine passed by, she overheard fragments of conversation. "Did you hear the VIP's coming in today, a major businessman? Both arms broken in a skiing accident." The word VIP caught her attention. There was an air of urgency and respect surrounding this patient. She couldn't help but wonder about the true significance of this individual. As she stood in the corridor, watching her colleagues bustle with newfound energy, Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that something important was about to unfold. Just then, Dr. Morrow walked up to her with an unusual expression on his face. Gone was the indifferent, condescending tone from the day before. Today there was something sharper, more authoritative in his voice. "Nurse Williams," he said curtly, "we have a high-profile patient arriving today, Mr. Richard Davis. He's in room 410. I need you to handle his care. Ensure he receives the best treatment possible. Understood?" Jasmine nodded, her heart quickening. She didn't need to ask why she had been chosen for this particular assignment. She had already learned the unspoken hierarchy that existed within the hospital. The senior nurses were always given the more prestigious tasks, the ones that allowed them to build their reputations. But Jasmine, being the newest and, perhaps in their eyes, the least experienced, was given what others had refused. Still, she refused to let this assignment deter her. If anything, it would prove that she could handle the pressure, that she could take on the toughest challenges with grace and professionalism. But as she walked toward room 410, a strange thought lingered in her mind. What made Mr. Davis so special? Why was this patient being treated with such reverence, so much more than any other? When Jasmine entered the room, she immediately understood why. The man lying in the bed before her was far from an ordinary patient. His presence was striking. His sharp, intelligent eyes seemed to survey the room with a quiet yet undeniable power. Despite his injuries, there was an aura of authority surrounding him. His demeanor, calm and collected, hinted at someone who had seen the world and controlled much of it. "Good morning, Mr. Davis," Jasmine said, trying to mask her curiosity with professionalism. "I'm Nurse Jasmine Williams, and I'll be taking care of you today." The man's eyes locked onto hers, sharp and assessing. He nodded, a small, knowing smile curling at the corners of his lips. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Nurse Williams," he replied smoothly, his voice deep and steady. "I appreciate you being here. I'm sure you're quite busy, but I'll do my best to keep things simple for you." There was a hint of something in his voice, something that suggested he wasn't just another wealthy businessman trying to get through a rough patch. Jasmine was used to dealing with patients who were anxious or in pain, but this man was different. His gaze was not filled with the usual fear or discomfort, but with something far more penetrating, something that told her he was someone who had seen the inner workings of the world and perhaps had some power to change things around him. As she began taking his vitals and assessing his condition, Mr. Davis spoke again, his tone measured and deliberate. "I've been told a lot about Rosewood. I've worked closely with a few of your doctors before. Dr. Morrow, in particular, is someone I've known for a long time." Jasmine's mind raced, trying to piece together the meaning of his words. It wasn't just casual conversation. There was an undercurrent of familiarity, a sense that Mr. Davis wasn't just a patient, but someone whose connections and influence reached far beyond the hospital walls. She focused on her work, but her thoughts couldn't help but drift. The fact that this patient was so well connected only added to the mystery surrounding him. Who was he really? What was his story? And why, of all the nurses in the hospital, had Dr. Morrow chosen her to care for him? The more Jasmine interacted with Mr. Davis, the more she realized that he wasn't just another privileged patient used to being catered to. His injuries were severe, but his mind was sharp. He never once let his physical pain distract him from the world around him. It was almost as if he were studying her every move, assessing not just her competence, but her character. And somehow, he seemed to know just how to speak to her in a way that made her feel seen rather than judged. As Jasmine prepared to leave the room after completing her initial assessment, Mr. Davis looked at her one last time, his gaze steady and contemplative. "You're new here, aren't you? I can tell," he said softly, his voice now tinged with a sense of quiet wisdom. "Don't let them break you. People like me, people with power, sometimes forget the struggles of those who aren't in the same position. But I see you, Nurse Williams, and I'll be watching." The words hung in the air long after she left his room. For the first time since entering Rosewood, Jasmine felt like someone, truly someone, had taken notice. Mr. Davis wasn't just a VIP patient. He was the catalyst, the person who would change everything. She wasn't sure yet how, but she felt a strange certainty that his presence at Rosewood would somehow force the hospital to reckon with its deeply embedded biases, starting with Dr. Morrow. Jasmine's heart swelled with a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just here to do her job, she was here to make a difference. And somehow, Mr. Davis was going to play a key role in that. The nurse's resilience and determination to prove herself. Jasmine woke the next morning with a renewed sense of purpose, the weight of the previous days, of the cold stares, the subtle but sharp dismissals, and the constant questioning of her worth still lingered in the back of her mind. Yet something had shifted. The brief exchange with Mr. Richard Davis, the VIP patient, had sparked a fire within her that nothing else had been able to ignite before. She was no longer just trying to survive in this environment. She was determined to thrive. She would prove herself not just to the hospital, but to herself. As she arrived at Rosewood that morning, the usual buzz of activity was already in full swing. The nurses were huddled around the nurses' station, chatting in their familiar cliques. Some greeted her with polite smiles, others with a thinly veiled sense of indifference. But today Jasmine walked through those doors with her head held higher. Today she would not shrink into the background. Today she would show them all what she was made of. Her first task of the morning was to prepare for rounds with Dr. Morrow, who, much to her chagrin, had not softened his demeanor since the first day. His icy, judgmental gaze was still a constant weight on her shoulders, as if he were waiting for her to fail so he could pounce on any mistake, no matter how small. His presence alone had a way of making the entire nurses' station feel tense, as though the slightest misstep could set off a chain of criticism that would ripple through the hospital. But today was different. Jasmine steeled herself against his disapproving gaze, reminding herself that she had nothing to prove to anyone but herself. She was fully qualified, highly skilled, and she had earned her place here. It was time to show Dr. Morrow that his assumptions were misplaced. As she moved through the hospital, administering medications, checking on patients, and assisting with various procedures, Jasmine felt the weight of the prejudices around her, but it no longer crushed her spirit. She had been through far worse. The whispered remarks and sidelong glances had lost their sting. She was determined to keep her focus on her patients where it mattered most. When she entered room 410, Mr. Davis was waiting for her. He looked up as she entered, his sharp eyes immediately assessing her. There was no judgment in his gaze, only a quiet understanding, as if he recognized the invisible burden she carried. His presence felt oddly comforting, like a reminder that not everyone saw her through the lens of prejudice. "How's my favorite nurse doing today?" he asked, his voice smooth but tinged with a hint of humor. His easy smile disarmed her for a moment, and Jasmine couldn't help but smile back. "I'm doing well, Mr. Davis," she replied, setting down her medical supplies. "How are you feeling today?" "I'm hanging in there. The pain's not as bad as yesterday, but I'm still getting used to being in one place for too long. I'm used to running things, not being the one on the receiving end," he said with a chuckle, his eyes twinkling. Jasmine could sense the layers behind his words. He wasn't just talking about physical discomfort. There was a deeper resignation, a sense of being used to controlling everything around him, to being the one in charge. But now he was the one who needed help. And Jasmine, despite the judgment and prejudice she had faced, was the one who was there for him. As she attended to his needs, checking his vitals and adjusting his medication, Jasmine felt something shift inside her. Mr. Davis wasn't just another patient. He was a reminder of why she was here, of why she had chosen this path in the first place. She wasn't here for recognition or to win anyone's approval. She was here to care for people, to make a difference in their lives, no matter their background, race, or social status. The morning passed quickly, and despite the challenges, Jasmine felt a sense of accomplishment. She hadn't just done her job, she had done it well, despite the barriers in her way. But it was the quiet moments with Mr. Davis that fueled her determination. As they talked more over the course of his recovery, he began to share more about his life, the struggles, the successes, the hidden truths that came with being a man of his stature. Jasmine listened, truly listened, without judgment, providing care with the same compassion she had always strived to give. But it was also in those quiet moments that she learned something crucial. Mr. Davis had seen her strength from the very first moment they met. He knew that the world around her would not make it easy for her, but he also knew that she had the strength to overcome it. "You have something they don't," he said one morning, his voice steady. "You have the kind of resolve that most people will never understand. Don't ever let them dim that light." His words hit her like a thunderclap. In that moment, Jasmine realized just how much power she held. It wasn't about the hospital or the nurses who judged her, or even Dr. Morrow. It was about her strength, her resolve, her ability to care for those who needed her most, no matter how hard the world tried to push her down. The days that followed were long, filled with physical exhaustion and emotional strain. Yet each time she felt the pressure mounting, she remembered Mr. Davis's words. She had to keep going, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. She would not let them see her falter. By the end of the week, Jasmine's work had begun to speak for itself. Her colleagues, those who had once viewed her with thinly veiled suspicion, had started to take notice. It wasn't just her skills that were being acknowledged. It was the quiet strength with which she carried herself, the unwavering professionalism in the face of daily adversity. And though the road ahead would remain difficult, Jasmine knew that she had already won the most important battle. She had proven to herself that no matter the prejudices she faced, no matter the challenges she encountered, she could stand tall. She was here to stay, and no one could take that away from her. The unexpected ally and a turning point. As the weeks wore on, Jasmine found herself navigating the complex web of Rosewood Medical Center's social and professional dynamics. She had learned to adapt, to perform her duties with an unshakable poise, even as the weight of racial prejudice and subtle exclusion pressed down on her from all sides. But amidst the challenges, there was one constant: her determination. No matter how many times she was overlooked or treated as though she didn't belong, she would rise above it. Jasmine was certain that her presence at Rosewood, though unwelcome to some, was a spark that could ignite change. Yet, it wasn't just her resolve that kept her going. Unbeknownst to her, a series of events was quietly unfolding that would alter the course of her experience at Rosewood and perhaps change the hospital forever. It all began one chilly morning when Jasmine was walking down the corridor toward the nurses' station. As she passed the administrative offices, she caught sight of someone she didn't recognize. A man in his mid-40s, impeccably dressed, with an air of authority that immediately stood out. He was standing by the door of Dr. Morrow's office, speaking in low, measured tones to the doctor, who appeared tense and deferential. The scene struck Jasmine as odd. Dr. Morrow, who often carried himself with an air of superiority, was now listening intently to this man. The brief glance Jasmine exchanged with the stranger revealed a quiet understanding, a look of someone who had seen much of the world and carried weight with each word spoken. It wasn't until later that day, after Jasmine had finished her rounds, that she would learn just who this man was. She was at the nurse's station, reviewing her patient chart for the next shift, when a voice behind her startled her. "Nurse Williams, may I speak with you for a moment?" Turning around, she found herself face to face with the man she had seen earlier. He was smiling now, a soft, almost knowing smile that carried a sense of purpose. "I'm Thomas Hawthorne," he said, extending his hand. "I've been observing you for some time now." Jasmine's brow furrowed in confusion. She hadn't seen him before at Rosewood, and there was no reason for a man like him to take notice of someone like her. But his words had a strange weight to them, as if he was well versed in the hidden currents that ran beneath the surface of the hospital. Observing me? Jasmine repeated, uncertain of his meaning. Hawthorne nodded, his eyes scanning her face with an intensity that made her feel as if he could see right through her. You've been under a lot of scrutiny here, haven't you? I can see it in the way they treat you, the subtle exclusions, the microaggressions. I've been watching. I know what it's like. For a moment, Jasmine didn't know how to respond. She had spent so many days feeling invisible, as if her very presence was a disruption to the status quo. But now, here was someone who saw her, truly saw her, and acknowledged the struggle she had been enduring without saying a word. There was no pity in his gaze, only an understanding that resonated deeply within her. I've seen the way Dr. Morrow treats you, Hawthorne continued, his voice steady, and I've seen how you've handled it, with dignity, with grace. Most people wouldn't last a week here, but you've held your ground. Jasmine felt a surge of pride, but also wariness. Who was this man, and why was he telling her this now? I'm not here to make promises, he said, noticing the uncertainty in her eyes. But I can tell you this, you're not alone in this fight. There are people here who recognize your value, even if they're not saying it, and sometimes you don't need to fight alone. His words hit her like a wave. For the first time since arriving at Rosewood, Jasmine felt a sense of validation, not just for her skills, but for her humanity. She wasn't just a token hire, a diversity hire to fulfill some statistic. She was a nurse, a professional, and someone worthy of respect. And finally, someone who had the power to make a real difference had taken notice. I don't understand, Jasmine admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Why me? Why now? Hawthorne smiled, a glimmer of something behind his eyes. Because I see potential. And because it's time for a change around here. Rosewood has a long history of playing it safe, of protecting the status quo. But I think it's time we shake things up. Jasmine's heart raced. She had often felt like she was fighting an uphill battle, not just against the systemic prejudices within the hospital, but against an invisible wall that seemed to have been built into the very foundation of Rosewood. And now, it seemed that someone with power, someone who wasn't afraid to make waves, was finally acknowledging that change was necessary. Hawthorne placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm yet reassuring. I've been working with several other key figures within the hospital to address the toxic culture here. We need strong, driven individuals like you to be part of that change. You've already proven your worth. Don't let them tell you otherwise. Jasmine stood there for a long moment, absorbing his words. She had never expected something like this. The journey to this point had been difficult, grueling even, yet now it felt as if there was a glimmer of hope. The road ahead would still be long, but for the first time, Jasmine felt as though she was not walking it alone. I won't, she said quietly, her resolve hardening like steel. I won't let them break me. As Hawthorne walked away, his presence in her life had already begun to shift the balance of power. The quiet, unspoken solidarity he had offered her was a turning point, one that Jasmine would carry with her as she continued her journey through Rosewood. The tide was slowly beginning to turn, and with Hawthorne's support, Jasmine was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As Jasmine stood in the hallway watching Hawthorne walk away, a sense of purpose filled her heart. She wasn't just a nurse, she was a force for change, a catalyst in a system that had long been broken. The struggles she had faced, the prejudice and the isolation, none of it would define her. Instead, she would rise above it, and with the unexpected support of allies like Hawthorne, she would be the one to bring change to Rosewood. But Jasmine knew she wasn't alone in this fight. Her journey was one that echoed the stories of countless others, those who had fought against the odds, who had been told they weren't enough, only to prove everyone wrong. And her fight was just beginning. If you've ever felt like an outsider, if you've ever been underestimated or made to feel invisible, Jasmine's story is a reminder that your strength is undeniable. No matter the obstacles, you have the power to break through them and create a future where your worth is recognized, not by the standards of others, but by your own. Are you ready to stand up for what's right? To show the world what you're made of, no matter the adversity you face? Jasmine's journey has only just begun, but it's a journey that can inspire us all. Leave a comment below, share your thoughts on Jasmine's journey, or tell us about a time when you had to overcome obstacles and fight for your place. We want to hear your story. And don't forget to subscribe. There are more stories like this one, stories of resilience, strength, and the power of change. Together, we can make a difference, one story at a time.